Okay, what video of his should I look at today? No, that's bait. No, that one's bait. No, I don't want to do that one, it's bait. I took the goddamn bait. Hello, and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, Braxton Hunter of Trinity Radio baited me into responding to another of those questions for atheist videos, so let's get on with it.
But now, as 2025 is upon us, I've got 5 questions for atheists in 2025, given certain events and current debates in the worldview discussion arena. If you're an atheist, I want to know what your answer is to these questions.
Well, at least this time he's not pretending that he's not attempting to ask gotcha questions to leave atheists unable to give good answers.
So let's just jump right in. Question 1. Cameron Bertuzzi over at Capturing Christianity recently caused a lot of controversy by saying he no longer takes atheism seriously.
Oh, was that a controversy? Guess I missed it on account of the fact that I don't take Cameron seriously.
The reason why I don't take atheism seriously any longer is because even if we accept the atheist's strongest argument, it still wouldn't prove atheism.
So I don't know the surrounding context for this, and ordinarily I would go and find Cameron's video in order to make sure that I was responding correctly, but I'm not feeling masochistic enough for that today. But what I'm getting at here is that most atheist arguments are against specific God claims rather than just the general concept of a God. And that's intentional because the concept of a God can be watered down to a point where it becomes completely unfalsifiable. Like the position of deism, a God being of some kind caused the Big Bang and then left the universe to its own devices to play out on its own. This is a position that isn't even really worth arguing against, as it has no bearing on our lives at all. Why should I care if such a being exists, if the universe is the same whether or not it exists, and it doesn't have any intentions or plans regarding humanity anyway? So yeah, if you dilute God down to essentially nothing, then atheists don't argue against its existence. But that's not the God that Christians believe in. That's just the hidey hole that they retreat to in order to cover their God with a shroud of unfalsifiability.
We have these really powerful arguments, at least from our perspective, on the theist side, like arguments from fine-tuning.
The fine-tuning argument is basically his question number 5, so I'll leave this alone for now, but we will circle back to it.
But yes, there are arguments on the other side that are meant to show that it's unlikely God exists or that God does not exist, like arguments from evil or divine hiddenness arguments.
Yep. But, as I've already alluded to, these arguments rely on certain definitions of God, and these are not definitions that all theists would universally agree with. In fact, if you want to, they are all really easy to wiggle out of. Problem of evil? Well, the God I believe in isn't omnibenevolent, so that's why bad things happen. Your argument is invalid. Divine hiddenness? Silly atheist, why would you think that God intervenes in our lives? Clearly, God is an outside observer. Because these arguments are effectively responses to specific claims about God, they can be dismissed by just not making those claims anymore. And what's weird is that a lot of Christians seem to think that this is some point in their favor. Like, yeah, that would be a good argument against the Christian God, but if I set aside the Christian God, you can't argue against that other hypothetical God. Ergo, atheism is wrong, so I win, despite having to discard the God that I believe in order to do so.
And so this puts us in an interesting spot. We've got arguments for and against. But as Philip Goff suggested recently, perhaps you have a God of limited power.
My point exactly! You saw nothing. There you go. A Christian who thinks that God is omnipotent, so by definition does not have limited power, is now saying that Maybe God has limited power in order to escape from the arguments against an omnipotent God. Here's a thought. How about you define the God that you believe in and then stick to that definition? Best case scenario here is you get an atheist to say, okay, I guess I'm technically an agnostic rather than an atheist, but I still don't believe in your God because of the same reasons that I've already given. Do you consider that a win? If so, why?
This would mean you have really powerful arguments from God on the theist side, like the fine-tuning arguments, but then the arguments from evil and divine hiddenness no longer become powerful arguments for atheism. Instead, what they are arguments for a limited God, but not arguments for no God. And so there's no reason to take atheism seriously, someone might decide. So the question is Cameron wrong? And if so, why is he wrong?
Yes, he's wrong, because if your dismissal of atheism includes a dismissal of the God that you believe in, then there's no reason to take you seriously. This is getting pretty close to just definition fight territory, where philosophers like to insist that being an atheist includes the positive claim that there are no gods, thus imparting the atheist with the burden of proof. Such people deride the lack of belief atheists as not being serious in much the same way as Cameron and Braxton are doing here. It's not that their position isn't worth considering, it's that because of some technicality of language, they should use a slightly different label for themselves. So clearly anyone who uses the wrong label just can't be a serious interlocutor worthy of spending time on. So here's the thing with that. I know such people hate that chart showing agnostic and gnostic on one axis with atheist and theist on the other, giving us the category of agnostic atheist, to which I belong. But while that chart may not represent a proper use of those labels for the purpose of a formal debate on the existence of an ill-defined God where the atheist position comes with the burden of proof, it is an accurate representation of how people use those labels in everyday conversation. Do I think that a deistic God caused the Big Bang and then left the universe alone? No. Can I prove that such a God doesn't exist? Also no, so I'm not going to claim with 100% certainty that it does not. So while I do not believe it exists, I'm not making a knowledge claim. More relevant here, though, is the goal of the conversation. Burden of proof in a formal debate is fairly easy to determine. The person making the claim has the burden of proof. So if the proposition is that no gods exist, then the person arguing on the atheist side has the burden of proof. If the proposition is that the Christian God exists, then the Christian side has the burden of proof. But that's not how it works out here in the real world where we have real conversations. The burden of proof out here lies with the person who actually cares about convincing the other person of their position. So while I am unusual in the sense that my whole career at this point is basically trying to convince people that God doesn't exist, with my usual focus being on the Christian God, in most cases, the atheist doesn't actually care whether or not you believe in God, as long as your belief in God doesn't interfere with their ability to live their own life. But I mean, all this is kind of irrelevant. Let's just get back to the main issue here. In order to not take atheists seriously, you have to be willing to compromise on your own beliefs. I wonder if the God you believe in would approve of you throwing him under the bus just to get a technical gotcha.
Question 2. Some atheist creators seem to think that the recent presidential election was so important that it changes the way they should do things on their channels.
Yeah. The guy being backed by explicit Christian nationalists who openly want to transform the American government into a Christian theocracy won the election. Seems like anyone who cares about religious freedom would consider that to be a pretty important cultural turning point worth focusing on. At this point, he plays clips from both Prophet of Zod and Christy Burke, saying that they're going to shift focus, with Zod being non-specific but still referencing the election, and Christy saying she's explicitly going to be focusing more on politics now. We don't need to watch that, so I'm gonna skip it.
Why do you think that this election was so impactful to atheists in this way?
Because the winning candidate was backed by Christian nationalists. I don't see why that's such a hard thing for you to understand.
What did it reveal about the culture?
Okay, buckle up, chucklefucks. This is going to be a long tangent. So if you want to get all depressed about it, what it revealed about the culture is that we're seeing a rise of fascism, and a distressing 42% of registered voters approve specifically of the way Trump is handling deportations, according to a recent poll. Ernst Frankl was a Jewish lawyer working in Germany during the rise of the Third Reich. He fled the country in 1938 and in 1941 published the book The Dual State, which discussed how the Nazis rose to power mostly through legal legal means while enabling themselves to ignore the German Constitution when convenient. The way they operated in the early years was through an arbitrary suspension of the constitutional protections for people that they wanted to suppress, while largely preserving the rule of law for the average German citizen. They did this by constantly claiming that the country was in a state of emergency, thus legitimizing the suspension of some constitutional protections for the sake of mitigating this emergency. The Nazis specifically used the Reichstag fire to pressure President Paul von Hindenburg into issuing the Reichstag fire decree, granting emergency powers to the Chancellor of Germany, some guy named Adolf or something. This allowed them to imprison anyone suspected of having communist or socialist sympathies without giving them a chance to defend themselves in court, while allowing most Germans to live their lives undisrupted. This is why the First They Came For poem starts with the socialists. So why the history lesson here? Well, on Trump's first day in office, he declared a national emergency over the southern border. And now we have a situation where hundreds of people have been deported to a prison notorious for its use of torture without even giving the appearance of due process. At least one person, Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, has been admitted to have been deported due to an administrative error, but the Trump administration is refusing to lift a finger to have him released, despite the Supreme Court unanimously ruling that he must be returned. Additionally, of the hundreds of people sent to this torture prison, the majority do not have a criminal record and don't even have criminal charges filed against them. It's bad enough to pay a foreign government to torture your criminals for you. That, in and of itself, would be a heinous violation of human rights. But they are paying this foreign government to torture people who haven't even been charged with a crime. That is quite clearly the suspension of constitutional protections for a targeted group of people while largely preserving the rule of law for the average American citizen. And with Trump floating the idea of sending American citizens to El Salvador,
I'd like to go a step further. I mean, I said it to Pam. I don't know what the laws are. We always have to obey the laws, but we also have homegrown criminals that push people into subways, that hit elderly ladies on the back of the head with a baseball bat when they're not looking, that are absolute monsters. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country.
And with the recent arrests of legal residents of the United States because of how they express opposition to the Trump regime, I don't think it's alarmist to say that he's setting the stage to be able to make political dissidents just disappear without due process, even if those dissidents are American-born American citizens. Hell, let's dive in a little bit deeper. Umberto Eco was an Italian author who grew up during Mussolini's reign, even winning an award at the age of 10 for writing an essay about why you should die for the glory of Mussolini. In 1995, he wrote an essay called Fascism, which explains why fascism can sometimes be hard to identify, while providing a list of 14 characteristics of fascism. It's important to note that this is not a simple checklist where society is fascist if it checks the boxes beside enough of the points, and there are non-fascist governments and organizations that will hit some of the boxes at times as well. To quote the essay directly, it would be so much easier for us if there appeared on the world scene somebody saying, "I want to reopen Auschwitz. I want the black shirts to parade again in the Italian squares." Life is not that simple. Fascism can come back under the most innocent of disguises. Our duty is to uncover it and point our finger at any of its new instances, every day, in every part of the world. But if you read the whole essay, complete with the context surrounding each of the points, the similarities between the United States and this description of fascism are rather frightening. So despite my saying that this is not a list of checkboxes, let's check some boxes, shall we? 1. Cult of tradition. There can be no advancement of learning. Truth has already been spelled out once and for all, and we can only keep interpreting its message. This goes quite nicely with the next one. 2. Rejection of modernism. Modern culture is depraved. We need to return to an earlier and more wholesome time. Taken together, these are the essence of the whole idea behind Make America Great Again. Go back to before DEI, CRT, and the woke mind virus ruined society. 3. A cult of action for action's sake. Act without thinking. Thinking is emasculation. You can't trust the intellectuals. To use Eco's words, universities are a nest of Reds. To modernize that a bit, cultural Marxism is taking over our universities. Part of this is that the intellectuals on the side of the fascists will attack modern culture for betraying traditional values, which immediately brought Jordan Peterson to mind. If you want to see that sort of behavior on full display, just read through his article in the National Post explaining his decision to resign from the University of Toronto. It is just jam-packed full of that kind of rhetoric. And also, I didn't learn about this until after I wrote this part of the script. There's that book called War on Science that Richard Dawkins is a part of. We'll get to that later. This is foreshadowing. 4 is that disagreement is tantamount to treason. And we've seen Trump post memes saying that Liz Cheney is guilty of treason and calling for televised military tribunals. We've seen Musk call Senator Mark Kelly a traitor for defending Ukraine.
You give it out, in other words. Democratic Arizona Senator Mark Kelly posted on X about his trip to Ukraine to push for continuing to send U.S. weapons and support there, and you posted that he was a traitor. Well, why do that?
Well, I think somebody should care about the interests of the United States above the interests of another country. And if they don't, they're a traitor.
We've seen Trump sign executive orders calling for the investigation into members of his previous administration who went on to criticize his actions and calling them traitors while signing it.
And I think what he did, he wrote a book, Anonymous, said all sorts of lies, bad things. And I think it's like a traitor.
And those are just the instances that come immediately to mind. I'm sure there are a bunch more that I'm forgetting about. 5 is related. Disagreement is the sign of diversity. Fascism needs consensus by exacerbating fear of differences, trying to make people afraid of both the outsider and intruders into your culture that are already here. For this one, need I say more than they're eating the dogs and cats in Springfield? The immigration fears work well for both the outsider and the intruder. Someone who has not yet immigrated is to be feared because they're going to contaminate the culture. And the ones that already have immigrated are already contaminating the culture. This is actually one of the reasons why Jewish people are a common fascist target. They have spread throughout the world while maintaining their cultural identity, so everywhere they go, they are outsiders, but they already live everywhere, so they're already present. 6 is that fascism derives from individual or social frustration by appealing to a frustrated middle class and stoking their fears caused by pressure from lower classes. This is where you find all that rhetoric about welfare queens wasting your tax dollars and buying lobster dinners with their food stamps, a ridiculous picture that doesn't exist in reality. Hell, the whole Department of Government Efficiency is playing into those fears. It's not just the welfare queens, it's anyone who works for the government. They're all a bunch of lazy, no-good fraudsters who need to be cut down and eliminated because they're taking your tax dollars. 7 is the obsession of a plot. They must be under attack at all times. Crooked Joe Biden rigged the election. The deep state is responsible for anything that goes wrong. The left wants to trans your kids and release criminals into the streets. And that leads into 8, which is that enemies must be simultaneously too strong and too weak. Yes, Crooked Joe Biden stole the election, but Sleepy Joe Biden can't even climb up that big set of stairs on Air Force One. Everyone is simultaneously pathetic and weak, but also the biggest threat the nation has ever seen. 9 is that life is lived for struggle. Hard times create strong men and all that. 10 is contempt for the weak. The whole Trump administration is an exercise in unearned bravado. Anyone in the administration that admits to making a mistake inevitably gets fired, like the lawyer who said that Kilmar Garcia being sent to El Salvador was an administrative error. On top of that, you've got that whole tariff fiasco where Trump is so desperate to be seen as a strongman that he's willing to sabotage the world economy so that the leaders of other countries will have to do what he wants in order to get him to act with anything approaching sanity. And when they do, he mocks them for being weak. 11 is that everybody is educated to become a hero, and they should crave a heroic death. This one is a bit more subtle and less exclusive to the Trump administration, but can definitely be seen in the pedestal that the military is placed on. 12 is machismo, a disdain for women, and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, and frequently involves playing with weapons. So yeah, all the anti-LGBTQ stuff, the blatant misogyny, and posing for Christmas card pictures with your family all wielding deadly weapons. Do I even need to elaborate on this one? 13 is selective populism. The leader interprets and expresses what is said to be the common will of the people, with the people being assumed to be a monolith. We see this in Trump claiming to have the mandate of the people and talking as though his opinion is the opinion of the people. That's why nobody watches CNN, because they're too concerned with freeing innocent people from torture prison instead of Trump clearing criminals off the streets.
Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over? And that's why nobody watches you anymore. You know, you have no credibility.
Never mind that by the end of March, CNN moved from 9th to 5th place in terms of total viewers. Trump doesn't like them, so MAGA doesn't like them, so nobody watches them because that's the will of the people. And of course, we've got those montages of all the Trump staff taking turns sucking his dick and telling him how awesome he is, that he really is the bestest boy ever who speaks for all the people.
Thank you for your leadership and thank you for everything you're doing.
I want to thank you for standing up to the Chinese Communist Party.
I want to thank you as well for the shipbuilding.
Your vision is a turning point and an inflection point in American history.
Your leadership at the border, absolutely remarkable.
What you're doing now, I think, is a great service to our country, but ultimately to the world.
You were overwhelmingly elected by the biggest majority.
And finally, 14 is that the language of fascism is newspeak, simplified concepts presented without nuance in an impoverished vocabulary. All the news about anything Trump did wrong is fake news. All the immigrants being deported are terrorists. Everything Trump does is the greatest, the biggest, the best. All nuance is lost for the sake of a soundbite. And of course, we can't forget that war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and deportations liberate millions, as can be seen on the chyron of the Jesse Waters show, which is basically Trump propaganda at this point. So yeah, after that very brief aside on the Trump regime's fascism that was still barely scratching the surface, I hope you can see why people who oppose fascism might pivot their content to focus more on, opposing fascism rather than sticking to Christianity. Of course, this raises several more questions, like how come Christianity and fascism are so intertwined? Both historically and today, fascism worked with religious authorities to accomplish their goals. You can argue till you're blue in the face about whether or not Hitler was, in his heart of hearts, technically an atheist, but to me that's largely irrelevant, as he made use of Christianity quite heavily in his regime. In the same way, I'd argue that Trump actually is, in his heart of hearts, an atheist, but he knows that Christians hold the reins of power in the United States, so he panders to them in order to maintain his control. So channels that have been fighting against allowing Christians to hold the reins of power probably have an interest in how Trump used those reins to gain his own power. Also, I would think that Christian influencers would want to distance themselves from a guy who is so clearly just using Christianity to prop himself up. Do you really think that he believes in Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior? If you do, I got a bridge I want to sell you.
Question 3. Many atheists are determinists.
As are many Christians. So it sounds like whatever this question is going to be, it should be asked of determinists, not of atheists.
Meaning that they don't believe in free will, at least not of the sort that many people think of when they hear the term free will. They believe that the past history of the universe is like to a billion trains of dominoes.
Okay, I'm just going to skip ahead a bit. He spends quite a bit of time explaining that determinism is basically the belief that everything, including our thoughts and actions, are basically a result of the chain of causes and effects going back to the initial state of the universe. So everything that has ever and will ever happen has already been determined by those starting conditions.
On the other hand, maybe some atheists think that we have what's called libertarian freedom, the notion that whatever you ended up choosing, you really could have done otherwise.
So he's even explicitly acknowledging that not all atheists are determinists. Good for you, I guess, but then why is this in a Questions for Atheists video?
So here's my question. If you're a determinist, how do we hold people morally culpable for things they do that could not have been otherwise, given the history of the universe?
Well, personally, I'm not a determinist, but that question seems nonsensical to me. If you are a determinist, then doesn't that kind of automatically mean that you have no choice but to hold people accountable for their actions? On account of the whole determinism thing? But really, whether determinism is true or not is rather irrelevant from a practical standpoint. We appear to have free will, so at the very least, we have the illusion of free will. So either determinism is true and we have no choice but to hold people accountable for their actions, or free will is true, in which case it makes sense to hold people accountable for their actions.
And if it is the case that you believe in free will of the libertarian sort as an atheist, how is that possible without God?
Counterpoint. How is that possible with God? You're going with the definition of free will that is, whatever choice you make, you could have made a different choice if you were in an exactly identical situation. Well, according to most Christians, God knows everything, and that includes everything that is going to happen in the future, which means that when you make a choice to do something, God knows what your choice will be before you make it, which means that you cannot choose otherwise. You will always, 100% of the time, make the choice that God knew you were going to make. It seems to me that actual libertarian free will would only be possible in a scenario where there is not someone who knows what all future actions and decisions will be.
Now, just as a note, there are many determinists who will say they are compatibilists.
Yes, and compatibilism is literally how they answer the question of moral responsibility in light of determinism. So what I'm getting from this question is that you just want someone to read the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page on compatibilism to you so that you don't have to read it for yourself. For myself, I just find this to be a boring conversation. So I'm just going to skip past the point where he dismisses compatibilism by saying it doesn't answer the question, despite it literally being the answer to his question, so we can move on to number 4. Though, just in case you don't believe me that that's what he does, here's what he says after explaining what compatibilism is.
So it doesn't answer the question. I'm asking that question.
And no, he doesn't say that after going into detail about classical compatibilism, compatibilism in transition, contemporary compatibilism, hierarchical compatibilism, reasons responsive compatibilism, or any of the other forms of compatibilism, and explaining why they are all wrong. He just says that compatibilism says that moral responsibility and determinism are compatible, and then ignores all of the many answers to his question in order to say that they don't answer his question. It's Philosoph-Bro apologetics at its finest.
Number 4, Richard Dawkins has long been praised by atheists as one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheism.
And if you think he's still receiving such praise, then you're completely out of touch with the current atheist movement. Hell, Dawkins is closer to your side of the fence today than the atheist side. He's calling himself a cultural Christian now and saying that Christianity is a fundamentally decent religion.
I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer. But there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. So I count myself a cultural Christian. I think it would matter if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful. If I had to choose between Christianity and Islam, I choose Christianity every single time. I mean, it seems to me to be a fundamentally decent religion in a way that I think Islam is not.
Side note, I love that later on in that very professional news interview, the host ran out of time on their free meeting.
Of course, I don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and I don't believe you do either. Do you?
Best part about that is that after she clicks the OK button, she ends the interview telling Dawkins that she has been told that she has to stop.
Do you?
Do I believe that Jesus rose from the dead? I mean, you're really putting me on the spot. I would like to believe he did. Yes, I mentioned the resurrection. I mentioned the resurrection. By the way, just quickly, because I've been told we've got to stop.
This professional news outlet owned by Global can't be arsed to pay for a professional license for Zoom. So when the pop-up saying you have to end the call or pay for premium shows up, that's it. Interview's over, time to move on. Back on topic, his becoming a cultural Christian seems like quite the departure from how he described God in his book, The God Delusion.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
So that's what you think of God?
Yeah.
Now, I am sure that his stance could be defended by saying that he's only talking about Old Testament God there, whereas he said that Christianity is fundamentally decent, so that's New Testament stuff. Except if the Old Testament weren't a fundamental part of Christianity, they would have not included it in Christianity. And if that had happened, instead of having an Old Testament and a New Testament, we'd just have the New, and it probably wouldn't be called that. Also, this doesn't quite get along with another passage from the God Delusion. Quote, "But there are other teachings in the New Testament that no good person should support. I refer especially to the central doctrine of Christianity, that of atonement for original sin. This teaching, which lies at the heart of New Testament theology, is almost as morally obnoxious as the story of Abraham setting out to barbecue Isaac." Now, call me crazy, but I don't think the statement, Christianity is fundamentally decent, is really compatible with the teaching that is at the heart of New Testament theology is as obnoxious as the story of Abraham setting out to barbecue Isaac. And worth mentioning is that today the Trump administration is essentially waging a war on science, cutting funding, firing staff, eliminating programs, and so on. I promise you this is not a segue into a ground news head. I just realized what that sounds like. So naturally, people like Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, Lawrence Krauss, Jordan Peterson, and a bunch of other scientists and science-adjacent people have collaborated on a book called The War on Science, which naturally has nothing to do with the Trump administration's actual war on science, and is just a collection of grievances about how higher education is rife with cancel culture and DEI. Seems like just what is needed in these trying times. Never mind the guy cutting funding for AIDS research. A professor got fired for using a slur. It's a war on science. If you want more details on this ridiculousness, I highly recommend Drew's video on it over on his channel, Genetically Modified Skeptic. All this to say that Dawkins is a relic who has resorted to grifting the right wing in order to desperately cling to relevance.
Recently, he's caused some controversy with some comments about the trans debate.
Well, his controversies go back a lot farther than that, but yes, he is also wrong about trans people.
For many atheists, he's right about science when it comes to young earth creationism versus evolution, but he's wrong when it comes to this current cultural debate. Do you personally think he's right or wrong, and why?
He's wrong. Watch last week's video for more detail there, but I'm curious, why does it even matter? If I didn't know any better, I'd say that it looks like Braxton is approaching this from the religious standpoint, where there are people who are religious authorities who cannot be questioned. They are right all the time. If you look at atheism through such a lens, it's rather easy to see popular atheist figures as the equivalent of one of those religious figures. As such, it seems like this question is meant to prompt a re-examination of Christianity by means of calling into question the legitimacy of one of those so-called atheist authorities. But that's not actually how it works. Dawkins is correct about evolution and is incorrect about trans people. We can know this because the body of scientific evidence overwhelmingly supports Dawkins' position on evolution, but it overwhelmingly contradicts his position on trans people. Since we don't see him as an infallible or unquestionable authority, it is rather easy to simply say that, yes, he's right about this thing, and he's wrong about that one. And since he seems to have chosen the thing that he is wrong about to be his hill to die on, we simply no longer need to pay attention to him.
Now, for this last question, there's a little bit of setup. Here's a quote from Robin Collins about the fine-tuning of the universe, and I'd like to know what your reaction to it is. Suppose we went on a mission to Mars and found a domed structure in which everything was set up just right for life to exist.
Okay, I'm actually going to be skipping ahead now because as much as he says that this needs the setup, it's nothing new. It's just another iteration of the watchmaker argument. Dome structure on Mars, perfect for life. Well, as it turns out, the universe is that dome structure. Checkmate atheists. So let's just skip to the actual question.
What conclusion would we draw from finding this structure? Would we draw the conclusion that it just happened to form by chance? Certainly not. Instead, we would unanimously conclude that it was designed by some intelligent being.
That would depend on a lot of assumptions, but notably we've got a question of scale here. If life exists in the universe purely because of chance, having an extremely large universe would improve the chance of life happening. But in a domed structure small enough to fit on Mars, your opportunities for a chance to favor the development of life are quite limited.
Why would we draw this conclusion? Because an intelligent designer appears to be the only plausible explanation for the existence of the structure. That is the only alternative explanation we can think of, that the structure was formed by some natural process, seems extremely unlikely.
How many of these structures are there? And are they all identical? If there are many and they all have slightly varied properties, then it seems reasonable to conclude that the one that is perfect for life as we know it got those properties basically through chance rather than because of any design. Make enough iterations of a thing and eventually you'll get one specific iteration of that thing. Also notice the key phrase, life as we know it. It is possible that, under other conditions, life could arise that would not resemble what we know of as life on Earth. So how many other domes are there that contain different forms of life that are perfectly suited to their domes? This is the anthropic principle. The universe is perfect for life because life evolved to live in the universe, not because the universe was designed for life.
The universe is analogous to such a biosphere, according to recent findings in physics. Almost everything about the basic structure of the universe, for example, the fundamental laws and parameters of physics and the initial distribution of matter and energy, is balanced on a razor's edge for life to occur.
Well, that razor's edge isn't quite as sharp as apologists would have us believe. In fact, for some of the parameters, we're not even in the optimal universe for life. One study, for instance, found that a universe with slightly less dark energy than ours would have been more favorable to the development of life. In another article, according to physicist Fred Adams, the parameters of our universe could have varied by large factors and still allowed for working stars and potentially habitable planets. The force of gravity could have been 1,000 times stronger or 1 billion times weaker, and stars would still function as long-lived nuclear burning engines. The electromagnetic force could have been stronger or weaker by factors of 100. Nuclear reaction rates could have varied over many orders of magnitude. Alternative stellar physics could have produced the heavy elements that make up the basic raw materials for planets and people. Clearly, the parameters that determine stellar structure and evolution are not overly fine-tuned. And in a study with the hedgiest title to ever hedge, preliminary inconclusive hint of evidence against optimal fine-tuning of the cosmological constant for maximizing the fraction of baryons becoming life, theoretical physicist Don Page presents the evidence that the universe would be more fine-tuned for life if the cosmological constant were slightly negative rather than the slightly positive value that has been measured. So the fine-tuning of the universe appears to be less like a razor and more like the blunt end of a maul. And all of this is assuming that our universe is the only one, which is not necessarily a safe assumption. There are a number of cosmological models that result in multiple universes, either simultaneously or sequentially, and in a large enough set of universes, it seems inevitable that eventually at least one of them will land on a set of fundamental constants that allow for the eventual development of life. And worth mentioning is that my understanding of these topics is heavily reliant on the researchers summarizing their findings for news outlets. Why is that? Well, here's some of what can be found in one of the papers that I have just referenced. Look at that. Do you know what that means? Because I don't. Just looking at it makes me want to cry. If you do understand it, you probably spent a long time in school studying physics and cosmology, which I didn't because I'm just some idiot on the internet. So if you want to tell me that I'm wrong about what this equation says, then go ahead. But at least have the decency to hire a translator that speaks cosmologist to explain why to me, because, Braxton, I'm willing to bet that you don't understand this equation either. And while I'm not even going to pretend to understand any of the math involved in cosmology, I have curiously never seen an apologist address any of it either. They will confidently proclaim that they know the universe to be fine-tuned, but they don't bring equations that actual cosmologists could scrutinize to the table to support that conclusion. They're just going by the vibes. Yeah, man, seems fine-tuned because, like, that's what makes sense to me, man. But why should I take you seriously if you can't explain it aside from an appeal to our intuitions? Now, to be fair to Braxton, I am about to skip a bit where he does read from a list compiled by Robin Collins that does cite a bunch of cosmologists regarding fine-tuning, so I could see him disagreeing with this characterization, but the most recent citation in the list is from 1989. I've been citing material published from 2011 to 2024. At the very least, this indicates that this is still an open question in cosmology. If it's still an open question, then as non-cosmologists, the best that both Braxton and myself can do is point to people that are smarter than we are working in that field. How do we, as lay people, decide which ones are correct? Best we can do is use our intuition. So yeah, my pointing to papers suggesting that the universe is not fine-tuned is not a slam dunk case by any means. But your pointing to papers that are several decades older than mine saying that it is fine-tuned is also not a slam dunk.
Now, these are some of the kinds of facts that are often used to make fine-tuning arguments. Some of the best arguments for God's existence, according to almost everyone involved.
I have often made the claim that arguments based in cosmology are the last bastion of apologetics because ultimately every argument for God, when you break it down and analyze it, winds up being an argument from ignorance. We don't know how X could happen without a God, therefore God. Our understanding of science has progressed to a point where previous unknowns that had been explained with God now have scientific explanations no God required. Cosmology, though, is a complicated field with many unknowns remaining. So it is quite telling that this place where all the unknowns live is also where the best arguments for God live.
So here's the question. Are we wrong to think that this supports theism?
Yes.
If so, why?
Because at best, you've got a God of the gaps argument. We don't know how the universe could be the way it is without God, therefore God. That is, at its heart, a very weak support for theism, and by your admission here, it's the best you've got. And that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Alan Bear 6505, who says, regarding original sin, didn't Jesus die to wipe away our sins? If so, why is original sin still a thing? Because, Alan, you don't get your sins wiped away unless you accept Jesus into your heart. So everyone still has to be born into sin to allow them to choose to love Jesus at eternal hellfire point. Thanks for watching. Thanks to everyone who went to throne.com/Vice Rhino to help with some of the equipment. Y'all just completely cleared the list out, so I threw some hard drives on it now. I honestly didn't expect that you guys would buy literally everything on the list. Amusingly, a bunch of them arrived on my middle child's birthday, so I got more presents than they did on their birthday. But don't worry, I'm not a dick. I didn't rub it in. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Sirs every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Piper for being my editor, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the fascism that is rising in the administration that is my channel. If you'd like to make people who disagree with you disappear, then you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/Vice Rhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Machismo. Macho man. I want to be a macho man. That's why I play with my guns. I love saying buckle up, chuckle fucks. And it's hard for me to not say that when I'm telling my like 6-year-old to buckle up. So yeah, parenting is hard because I can't say buckle up, chuckle fucks to my kids. That was my girlfriend saying she's coming home. I'm happy to see her. She's coming home.